Well, welcome everyone. My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm Director of Adult Programs here at the Sid Richardson Museum, and I'm delighted to have y'all here for tonight's lecture. Before I introduce our guest speaker for tonight, I'd first like to respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And I especially want to acknowledge and pay respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, which include the Waco, Kachai, Tawakoni, and Talivea, upon whose historical homeland we're conducting tonight's program. And while I recognize that a simple statement is insufficient to support the rights and well-beings of Indigenous peoples, I like to say a land acknowledgement to remind myself to continue to educate myself and others on the past and present histories of Native communities in North Texas and beyond, like those represented in our collection. And what's also represented in our collection is the image of the cowboy. And often the image of the cowboy is portrayed as a white man, like those depicted by Charles Russell and Frederic Remington that you see in the paintings that Sid Richardson collected that are now currently on display in our galleries. And yet in Texas, a quarter of the 35,000 cowboys who participated in cattle drives between 1866 and 1895 were Black. And less understood or appreciated is that many of these cowboys learned their craft while enslaved. These men participated in cattle roundups and short cattle drives, branding cattle and tending livestock. And so for many of these Black cowboys in the 19th century, their first job was managing horses and cattle from horseback. And then after the Civil War, many of these men continued to work on ranches throughout Texas. And some went on to drives, but many stayed and continued to work on the open range. And so tonight's talk will provide a window into the lived experiences of enslaved and free Black cowboys in Texas, as our guest speaker tonight will share through their words how these men broke horses, managed stampedes, and lived their lives. So our guest speaker tonight is Ron Davis. He is a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. His dissertation project examines enslaved cowboys, labor, and resistance in antebellum Texas. He is the fellow for the Center for History and Culture of Southeast Texas and the Upper Gulf Coast from Lamar University. He is also a 25-year veteran of the US military and served in various capacities through 5 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And because of these experiences, his research interests also include exploring the lived experiences of Black service women and men from the Revolutionary War to Operations Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. In addition, the US Air Force honored Davis with a 4th Air Force Aircrew Excellence Award in 2010 for safely conducting air-to-air refueling with an F-16 Falcon at night during a complete loss of electrical power in his aircraft, among other commendations and medals. And tonight we are honored to have Ron with us to explore the role of enslaved and free Black cowboys during the Republic of Texas and after statehood in Texas's nascent cattle industry. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ron. I'm going to give you the mic. Put that wherever you want.
Alrighty.
And this is on, so you can use that, and I'm going to demo it for you.
I need to grab my glasses. I'm getting a little older and can't read and see without glasses. Yeah, you can go ahead. Well, thank you all for taking time out of a Friday evening to spend some time with me as I share some of my research with you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Leslie, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to sharing kind of some of the research that I found and some things that some of us will already know because some of it is very well known, some of the people I've come across, especially if you're into cowboys. But there also is a story that we have yet to really hear. And part of that story is the Black cowboy story. And so that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. And I'll also talk about kind of how I just co-curated an exhibit on Black Cowboys, and it was at the Whitney Museum in San Antonio. And so I'll talk to you about that journey as well of how an exhibit comes to being. It's a real, for me, it's a funny story and it's interesting. I hope you all will enjoy it. So thank you, Leslie, again, for allowing me to be here. Get this right. Okay. On August 8th, 1843, rancher and cattle driver William Berry Duncan was driving a herd of cattle from Liberty County in Southeast Texas to New Orleans. At the end of what might have been a long day, he writes that he stayed all night at Cripps's. The purpose of this early cattle drive was to sell the herd of cattle for a profit in the region's largest city and cattle market. Duncan's diary provides unique insight into the travails of driving cattle to market. Throughout the journal, we learn about other drivers en route to New Orleans, the cattlemen of Texas and Louisiana, and slavery. Sometimes Duncan hires enslaved cowboys to stand watch over his herd of cattle while he sleeps. Other times, he enlists the assistance of free and enslaved Black cowboys to help him cross rivers or travel through the treacherous Louisiana bayous. And as the slide indicates, he also purchased enslaved people when he wrote, "Let Cripps have 31 beeves for a Negro." Not much is known about Mr. Cripps and the enslaved person Duncan purchased for 31 head of cattle. In Texas at the time, one cattle was worth approximately $5. However, during the 1840s, cattle sold in New Orleans and other parts of southern Louisiana for $9 on the low end and could be sold as high as $20 a head. About 2 weeks later, Duncan sold his remaining herd of cattle for $9 a head. In $1840, the enslaved person, now with Duncan, was valued at about $279, and it was during a recession. What does this price tell us about this person? According to the work of Randolph Campbell in Empire for Slavery, enslaved children in their early teenage years were valued at about $350 in 1844. This suggests that this enslaved person was fairly young, perhaps between the ages of 10 and 13. Young enough, according to several enslaved cowboys, to have begun riding horses and taking care of cattle and herds of horses. In fact, many enslaved cowboys began riding as young as 5 or 6. Some enslaved children began breaking horses by the time they were 10 years old. A scholar might wonder, or should wonder, what did Duncan see that made him interested in this enslaved child? Perhaps after arriving at Cripps's place, this nameless child assisted him bedding down the cattle, putting the cattle to bed at night. Or maybe Duncan saw him riding on Cripps's property, managing his herd of cattle. We may never know for sure, but whatever this child was doing, Duncan realized he could profit from his labor. Next, Duncan writes, simply went on, and I hope everyone can everyone see it and read it? Great. This enslaved child's last night was with his family on August 8th, 1843. Perhaps he was able to say goodbye to his parents and family that evening. However, it is distinctly possible that after sleeping on the decision, Duncan arranged the purchase first thing in the morning, and the child was taken from his family as he and Duncan and the other drivers with the herd got ready to leave for New Orleans. Again, it is difficult to say for certain what exactly happened. However, even for enslaved cowboys, the institution of slavery was the institution of slavery, and it meant the possibility of being sold away from your family and your kin. Finally, we know that the child could ride a horse. It would be unfeasible to expect the child to walk the distance to New Orleans further. If the cattle stampeded, the child could be badly injured. So most likely this enslaved child participated in his first cattle drive and was with Duncan when he sold his cattle, profiting from his labor immediately. For the rest of this talk, we will discuss the Works Progress Administration's slave narratives. Then we will explore how tax records show that there were enslaved cowboys in Texas, followed by the Civil War and the labor of enslaved cowboys. We will look at life after emancipation through the memoir of Hector Basie. We will wrap up by discussing how research and a little bit of luck can turn into a public history exhibit. Scholars estimate that approximately 1 of every 4 cowboys that went on drives was Black. I'll say that again because I think it's really important for us to consider when we think about kind of the idea and the picture of what a cowboy is. About 25% of the cowboys that trail cattle from South Texas to Kansas and beyond after the Civil War were African American. That is roughly 8,700 African American men that were cowboys. It's a large number. Black men were participants in one of the largest movements of livestock in US history. Now, when I first read this information, I was totally shocked. I mean, it blew my mind. One, because I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. And so we don't really have horses. But also, you know, growing up in the 80s and 90s, you know, what we always saw of cowboys were just white men. You know, I remember the Marlboro Man, and then I watched Westerns. One of my uncles made me watch Westerns. But it never felt for me like I was one of those cowboys because I never saw anyone that looked like me represented it. And so when I found this information out, it totally blew my mind. I mean, I just almost fell out my chair. No, I'm kidding. I didn't fall off the chair, but I was really, really astounded. And I knew that I had to find out more information about these men that had participated in this mythical thing. Like, we've made the cattle drive almost like a myth, and these men were a part of it. So these numbers were first reported by J. Marvin Hunter, a former president of the Old Trail Drivers Association in 1925. Does everyone know what a trail driver is? Because then I won't. Everyone does? Okay. Just in case, a trail driver is a specific designation. It's someone who went on cattle drives. So not all cowboys are trail drivers, because some cowboys didn't participate on cattle drives. They stayed at ranches. So I wondered if the old trail drivers knew in the 1920s that the cattle industry was so diverse, how did our image of the cowboy become whitewashed? Why throughout much of my life had cowboys always been portrayed and depicted as white? One thing that historians do when they learn something new is they kind of chew on it, you know, mentally. You just kind of like, you know, you got a good piece of brisket. I mean, and you don't want to swallow it because it tastes so good. But you just chew on it and you let it kind of sit there. It sits like in the back of your head. And because I'm in the military, you go for a run, and it's interesting how the subconscious really kind of takes over kind of the thinking process for you. And so as I was thinking about these things, I began to remember certain things from my past. So in 2002, I was fresh off active duty in the Navy in Oklahoma, which that's a long story, how you join the Navy and end up in the middle of the country where there's no water. But I was doing voter registration. And so some of the people said to me, hey, you need to go to this town, Arcadia. It's an old town, and they have a Black rodeo. And so I remember I grabbed these, like a stack of voter registration cards, and I got in my car. I didn't put together the rodeo and black together. I just didn't. So I get in my car. There's a little white Saturn 4-door, and I drive up there. It's hot. It's like it's late August, early September, and I remember I get out the car, I have a clipboard, and I'm walking around, and like there I see for the first time Black people riding horses. And then like not just riding horses, but riding horses expertly. And I'll never forget that. Like, I'll never forget that day, because I saw like these Black women as barrel racers. I didn't know what a barrel racer was. And they just, the way they fly across the field. I mean, it was just amazing, like poetry in motion. And then I saw guys roping and riding bulls and stair wrestling. And it was just something I had never imagined was a possibility. And so, as crazy as it was to end up in Oklahoma from Boston in the Navy, it was definitely something that for me was very important. And so I remember this story, like as I was kind of thinking about this 25% of cowboys being Black, I remembered that story. And I remember like sitting down, and so I'm walking around, and y'all know how people in the South are just nice. I'm from Boston, like people are not nice. They are rude, it's cold. I think because it's cold, you just want to get inside. You know, like it's not time to talk. Your feet are freezing. But I was walking around. I was thirsty, and this older gentleman, his name was Alan. I can't think of his last name. Tall guy, 6'2", big dude. And he says, "Hey, come on over here, sit down. What are you doing?" And so like I come in, I sit down, and you know, I introduced myself. "Hey, I'm doing voter registration. Are you guys registered?" Of course they were, because there's a generation gap when it comes to engagement in politics. Well, not so much anymore, but anyway, so they're registered to vote. And so they see I'm thirsty. They offer me some sweet tea. First time having sweet tea, not the last, definitely. And then they gave me some, like they fed me, right? I told them I was fresh off of active duty. My family's in Boston, and they fed me. And so as we started talking, they were telling me the stories of their lives, and like growing up on ranches and riding horses and like breaking horses and all those things that they learned how to do. And so like I'm sitting there eating. I remember I'm eating. Well, the brisket was good, and I'm eating some potato salad. And I asked them, I was like, "Well, how long like have your family been cowboys?" And like they looked at me, and I remember plainly like his eyes. He said, "Before the Civil War." Now that was a moment where that just sticks out in my mind, right? Because it was something that I couldn't imagine Black cowboys, but that means that their family were cowboys and enslaved in Indian territory at the time. And so like once I remembered that, it changed kind of the impetus for telling the story. And so it made me ask like several questions. Did these enslaved cowboys, did they do cattle drives? Because there were cattle drives before the Civil War. Some of the earliest there were cattle drives. I mean, like we were talking, cattle come to Texas with the Spanish, and cattle are driven from Tejas at the time into Louisiana. And when the Spanish took over Louisiana from the French, and I'm going way off topic, but when the Spanish took over Louisiana from the French, they brought their brand of cattle ranching, which is open range and on horseback. They brought that with them. And so what we actually find is that on these Spanish ranches, before the Acadians get there are enslaved cowboys that are working on these ranches in the 1770s-ish. But what we also know is that some of these Spanish ranchers during the American Revolution trailed cattle to New Orleans to sell to George Washington. Right. I don't know if there were enslaved people on those cattle drives, but they trailed. So these cattle drives were happening a long time. I say that to say that these cattle drives happened long before 1867. We have cattle drives that take place by the 1770s from Louisiana and Texas and into New Orleans. And then that cattle goes to feed the soldiers for the American Revolution, a quarter of whom were African-American as well. Then I began to kind of wonder, where did they learn to ride? How did they learn to ride? You know, my understanding of slavery, and I think most people's understanding of slavery, is one of, you know, picking cotton, or if you know a little bit more, like sugar plantations in Louisiana and in the Brazos River Valley in Texas. But riding horses, it just seemed kind of antithetical to how slavery is taught. And it just seemed really antithetical to how slavery is taught. But then it hit me like some, if not most, of the cowboys who were born enslaved and participated, particularly in the early cattle drives after 1867, those guys must have been enslaved cowboys. And like you had asked me, like, do we have these lists? I would love to see those lists, because you don't really just hop on a horse and handle it. Like there's some time that you need, especially with tough horses. I've tried riding horses. I love it. And some horses, I'm like, let me get back down because I'm too old to get thrown anymore. But it takes some years to acquire the skill to be a good cowboy, which means that by 1867, right, the Civil War ends in 1865. 1867, they start going on cattle drives. There were certainly Black cowboys on those early cattle drives. Every trail driver that left memoirs, talks about Black cowboys being a part of the cattle drive from beginning to end. Those early ones, especially within the first 5 years, they had to have learned their skills as enslaved cowboys. And so these were some of the things that were going through my head as I entered graduate school and began to do this research. So now with the possibility of enslaved cowboys existing, what do you do next? It was time to like really do some research. So I was already familiar with the work historians wrote about slavery in Texas and the South, but I needed primary source evidence. Primary source evidence is evidence for historians that is from that time period, or is from the people who lived in that time period. And so fortunately I think for all Americans, we have what's called the slave narratives. So they're from the Works Progress Administration's slave narratives. And they were recorded between 1936 and 1938. So during the Great Depression, the federal government tried to put people back to work. And one of the agencies they created was the Works Progress Administration. And the WPA is what we call it. The WPA within that was was the Federal Writers Project. And that was specifically designed to get writers employed and educators, teachers, historians. And so one of the things that they began to do in the mid 1930s was they started interviewing the former slaves that were still alive. And this has proven to be a treasure trove for historians as we try to understand slavery. What's even better is that it's digitized now. So we don't have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. to do the research because that's expensive. So as I went through these narratives, and you go page by page, it's a slow, tedious process, but I met this guy and his name is James Cape. That's an actual picture of James Cape. I don't know if he was 110 because one of the things about the institution of slavery is that you don't really know when you're born. Some people did, which is kind of rare, but for the most part, they have an idea of when they were born in the spring, in the summer. They celebrate my birthday around this time kind of thing, if they celebrated it. But his testimony or his interview, he does reveal that he was probably born between the late 1820s to the probably mid to late 1830s, somewhere in there. His father, he said, was born in Africa and illegally transported to the United States after the transatlantic slave trade had been banned. Like the US said, we're not going to do it in 1808. We're not going to participate in it. Cape grew up in Southeast Texas, and he recalls, and these are his words, when I was old enough to sit on the horse, they learned me to ride tending horses. So this was my first piece of evidence that enslaved cowboys existed in Texas and as early as the 1830s. He tells us that he started riding and tending horses at a very young age, possibly between the ages of 6 and 10. He remembered the first work as members in riding horses, tending to the critters and horses on the ranch. So the critters, for those of us who may not know, are cattle. Subsequent research would show he probably started riding closer to 6 because there are several accounts of enslaved children breaking horses as young as 10, but definitely by 13. Cape was enslaved by Robert Houston. So like, this is one of the things that we do. So Cape talks about Mr. Houston and whatnot. And so one of the things that, as a historian is you try to verify the things that they say as much as possible. And here you have highlighted Robert Houston in Gonzales County in South Texas. Cape remembers while working on Houston's ranch that there were large herds of horses, sometimes as many as 1,000. He also talks about going on drives to Mexico while he was enslaved. Now, he said about one of the drives, many times we go across the Rio Grande River and fetch horses back to the master's ranch. These happened during slavery. Cape also remembered one particular time when he went with a crew of 6 men, most of probably who were enslaved. And as you can see from these tax assessor records, the Houston family owned quite a few slaves. And you see they owned slaves, horses, cattle. Right? Definitely more investment in horses. He talks about, but there's one drive where he talks about this drive to Mexico where they drove back 200 horses and then there was a hailstorm. The driver of the bus was a white man named Rogers, and he told the crew that a storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. First it rained, and then the hail began. And Cape says, "Them horses go plumb loco." The herd stampeded and ran wild. The storm lasted 10 minutes, and Cape said that the horses ran 10 miles in those 10 minutes. By his own admission, Cape he knew he was a good cowboy because he said, "I'm the best rider in the group." And it was his job whenever there was a stampede to get to the head of the stampede so that they could turn the horses, and get the stampede under control. So he says, "Horses follows the leader always." They delivered the herd back, and he earned a new saddle for his work. After the Civil War, Cape continued work as a cowhand throughout Texas. There are a number of men and women in the WPA narratives that discuss their work as herdspeople during slavery. And you can see that he actually passed away in Wichita Falls. He's an interesting character. He's one of my favorite people I've come across. Just very vibrant. So next, I began to wonder where in early Texas did enslaved cowboys live. So as I began to familiarize myself with the scholarship on cattle ranching in Texas, I came across the work of a cultural geographer named Terry Jordan. His work focuses exclusively on Anglo cattle ranching in Texas during the 19th century. One of his books, Trails to Texas, Southern Roots of Western Cattle Ranching, explores Anglo immigration to Texas and the establishment of American cattle ranching here. Jordan divides the Republic of Texas into 3 regions. The coastal prairies, which is this green outline, and the East Texas piney woods, which is this orange outline. And this is Louisiana right here. This orange outline kind of comes up. And then the Northeast prairies. So, and we're talking early statehood, before kind of Texas really begins to move west. Well, Texans couldn't move west because the Comanches controlled this area until after the Civil War. So there wasn't really a way they could move west. So as this colonization increased, each of the regions also saw growth of ranching and slavery. However, it was in the coastal prairies that dominated cattle ranching in Texas until the 1850s. He also stated that in 1840, 62% of all taxpayers in the coastal prairie who reported 100 or more cattle were also slave owners. So again, another one of those moments where my mind says, what? Like, you have to stop for a second. 62% of the largest cattlemen in Texas own slaves. Now, that doesn't mean that every enslaved person on that ranch or farm was a cowboy. Like, that's probably not the case. But it certainly means that some of them were. So like, it's hard to say like what numbers there were. I mean, hopefully one day I can come up with a ratio and talk to some mathematician and maybe they can help me out. I'm a historian, not a mathematician, so numbers don't work with me all that well. But it was just something that really piqued my interest, and it is the privilege of being in the academy where we get to sit and think about these things and ask these questions. So U.S. historians of slavery have constantly demonstrated. Well, let me back up. So we talked about that some of these people probably were probably cowboys of some sort, and they tended cattle for sure. But how do we kind of know that enslavers might use enslaved cowboys to not use enslaved people to tend cattle and be cowboys? One of the things that U.S. historians of slavery have consistently demonstrated is that the labor of enslaved cowboys was never restricted to cotton or cattle ranching. I mean, cotton or sugar production. Although that's definitely what most enslavers did and found profitable in the United States. Clearly cotton was king in the South, and sugar, was a distant second. But when we look at slavery beyond the United States and in the United States, we find that in the North, in North, South, and Central America, there was slavery in all those places. But you have a really diverse amount of labor. There were enslaved sailors. There were enslaved divers in Venezuela and Colombia. They were mechanics, blacksmiths, cooks, mines. And in Brazil, you had enslaved people working in mines. So what that also showed me was that slavery was whatever they decided was profitable for them to do. And that's what they had enslaved people do. So the shock of enslaved cowboys kind of wore off as I began to think about the range of what enslaved labor looked like, and realized that enslaved labor could be whatever was necessary. So there were some plantations in the Republic of Texas that grew agricultural crops and maintained ranches of herds of livestock. This is just a sample of some of the people I've come across. So these places that grew like cotton and had cattle, or sugar and had cattle, I call them dual plantations because they have dual uses. And looking at this table, this list represents the largest ranchers in Texas in 1840. This group of 24 people owned about 30% of the cattle in the entire coastal prairies region. If you remember, that is the region that outstripped all of Anglo Texas in the number of cattle that were there. So let's see, this region, the coastal prairies include, at the time, is Brazoria, Fort Bend, Galveston, Harris, Jackson, Jefferson, and Liberty counties. And just about 63 of these people were enslaved. So I had to go and verify for myself what Mr. Jordan said. What we also see is that there are 4 people with large numbers of enslaved people, especially for Texas. These are examples of planters who were also ranchers. Yet the size of their herd also means that they required herdsmen to manage them, especially since they practiced open range or unfenced cattle ranching. Now, there are a couple of ways that these dual plantations could manage enslaved cowboys. They could tax certain hands to manage the herds at different times of the year, like during roundups and things like that. You need quite a few people to brand cattle and stuff like that. But there is one, and it's James Perry. And if you're familiar with Texas, James Perry was one of the original 300. His sister was married to Stephen F. Austin. So they were very close. And reading his letters to Austin is very illuminating about, like Austin, I'm going off again. Austin wrote a letter to him because Perry, he was very wealthy. And as you can see, he owned a large number of enslaved people, which was a determiner of wealth at that time. And yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I will speak up. I can always talk louder. I can always do that. But he owned quite a few slaves, and he starts off in the 1830s growing cotton, but then he kind of transitioned his Peach Point plantation into growing sugar. But in a letter that I read from Austin to him, Austin implores him not to sell his Chocolate Bayou Ranch because it's great for cattle. And this was before I started doing the numbers in the tax records. And sure enough, here I come in the tax records, and there I find that he had 525 head of cattle. James F. Perry, Brazoria County, 32 enslaved people, 15 work horses, and 525 cattle. So, I'm already off this. The scale, so I'm just going to keep going. So, so what that shows me is that it's possible that some of the enslaved people were enslaved cowboys. And the Peach Point plantation, I have a map, but the Peach Point plantation is not within walking distance of Chocolate Bayou. And so as I was doing research on Perry, I came across, this is from the Perry family plantation daybook. They kept notes on what people did and what they had people do. And it's a little hard to read, but here, let's see. Here, 4 hands, Ben, John, Need or Ned, and Bill helping to Bayou. And then by Mexicans, 2 trips to Chocolate Bayou, 12 days, and self, 1 trip. Chocolate Bayou was his ranch. That's where he kept his cattle. Stephen F. Austin implored him to keep that ranch, not to sell it. He sends these 4 hands to tend cattle on Chocolate Bayou for I'm still trying to decipher this code. It's 462. 4 hands. I don't know if this is 62 days out of the year. Still trying to figure out what that actually means. But what it does tell me is that my assumption was correct in that there definitely were cattle, and he went himself to oversee the work that they went to do. And there were also some Mexicans that probably went with them, and they worked cattle. They probably worked on that cattle for a few weeks at a time, maybe for roundups or branding. And they were overseen by someone. So that's what a dual plantation might look like. And I wanted to use Perry because his name is associated with the original 300. Now, when we look here, now we'll talk about James Taylor White just a little bit. James Taylor White, he's described as the first cattle king of Texas. As you can see, 1840, he had almost 1,800 head of cattle. And that's just what was reported to the tax man. So how many he really had, we don't know. You can see that he had enslaved people that were 8 enslaved people who were under 15. We don't know whether they were boys or girls. 6 that were between the ages of 15 and 50. This is what slavery scholars say is prime working age. And the reason why we know this is because they were taxed differently in 1840. And so we can tell from the tax records their ages. I hope I'm not boring anyone. I feel like I'm getting a little bit into the weeds. So I hope I'm keeping you like engaged. So from this, we can tell that one, he was a cattleman, he was a businessman. But what we also find are these travel logs. There were these people from different parts of the South and the North that came to Texas because there's something about Texas. Like, I'm not a Texan, but there is something about Texas that people always wanted to come and see. And so they had heard about James Taylor White. And this guy's name is Dr. Hardy. He was from South Carolina. In the 1830s, he traveled from South Carolina and to Texas with the express intent of seeing how James Taylor White ran his business of cattle ranching. And so he left a series of letters that he wrote about his experience here. And so one of the things he talks about was that James Taylor White started off small and grew his herd of cattle significantly. And he makes this interesting comment. He says that, I think I wrote it down, so I want to say it exactly. So he says, let me see. He says that, one of the things, I didn't write this down, but he says that in order to grow his herd, he built these little cottages for his workers to live in. Those were slave quarters. Some of them are still standing. Some archaeologists have found where those quarters are at on the plantation. James Taylor White, he didn't grow cotton. He didn't produce sugar. He grew corn. But back then, if you grew corn to feed yourself. This man was primarily a cattleman. Well, he would have called himself a stock raiser. He was a cattleman, though, a rancher. And it's hard to imagine that several of these enslaved people were enslaved cowboys, and they were on horseback. He didn't really leave any written records, but some of his descendants did leave some written records, and they talk about these enslaved cowboys. So this is how we piece these histories together. But one thing we know is that if the richest man is doing it, then we know other people are probably doing it too. And so throughout my research, I was able to see, I don't want to go into too much, but I was able to see that that a number of people, if you look, you can see that he only enslaves, well, I would say only, but his enslaved labor force is relatively small. And the reason why is because, depends on who you ask, but in the Southeast prairies of Texas, you don't need a whole bunch of cowboys to tend the cattle. So you can manage cattle from horseback with a smaller group of people. 10 cowboys can really take care of about 1,000 head of cattle, especially in the Southeast. So there's these odd relationships between the number of enslaved people and the number of cattle and the number of horses, because you have to do it from horseback. But what we continue to see is that by 1845, the number of people with over 500 head of cattle grows exponentially. But what we also see is that many of these people are enslavers, and the number of slaves grows exponentially as well. So by 1845, there's about 60,000 head of cattle in the coastal prairies. And what you see here is that these the wealthiest of them own about 2/3 of the cattle in the county. And as you can see, many of them in one form or another used enslaved labor on their ranches. And the thing about, especially Liberty County in particular, Liberty County was the county in Texas at the time that had the most cattle. So by looking at all of these things, what we find is that, one, it was very tedious reading the writings of reading in cursive again, because we never do that anymore. But once you gain that skill back, it's really insightful to see how the link between slave labor and cattle ranching, especially in regions where cattle and ranching were very distinct. So this kind of, here, we'll just keep going because I'm running out of time. Now I want to talk to you about an interesting character. This is a quote from Francis Lubbock. So Lubbock is Texas Civil War governor, and Lubbock was a slave owner. But one of the things, like when you read Lubbock's memoirs, what he talks about are these enslaved cowboys that worked on his ranch. And let me see, this is what happens when you go off script. Okay, so this was something that Lubbock wrote. He wrote this to the Texas State Legislature in 1863. And there's more to it than this, but what he says is he asked them to call forth the resources of the state to meet the crisis that is upon her, the Civil War. He argued, "It is for your honorable body to take such measures as will develop them to the utmost and bring them into effective operation for the safety of the state and the success of the general cause." So Lubbock believes, what this is kind of saying is he believes that, like, every man, regardless of class, regardless of what they're doing, they need to go fight for the Confederacy. So then he writes, the swarms of men engaged in profitable business on their own account, who are exempted from or avoid military service upon one pretext or another, the thousands occupied in driving teams of cattle for the government and government contractors, must be placed in their respective companies and replaced with Negroes. So I remember I read this and I began to think, like, well, how does he know that there's enough Black cowboys to tend cattle? Well, like I said, Francis Lubbock was an enslaver. And as you can see here, there were enslaved people on his ranch. This is in Harris County, down by Houston, or outside of Houston. He had 150 head of horses and 3,500 head of cattle. This is 1854 tax assessor records. And we know that these enslaved people were cowboys because the governor tells us they were. He wrote, "Many of our Negro boys were fine horse breakers," in his memoir, 6 Decades in Texas. He also writes in some detail about several of the enslaved people on his ranch. First, he discusses these two men, Osborne and William. He states, and these are quotes directly from his memoir. He states that they were very valuable for their honesty and intelligence with cattle and horses. So this was his like observation of these two men. And he also says that they went on to become successful cowboys after the Civil War ended. But he actually talks about another cowboy, and I really have to wrap it up. He also talks about another cowboy, and his name is Willis or Cy. He doesn't really tell us which one, which is an interesting thing. He says that he's his favorite cowboy, but then he doesn't remember his name exactly. It's one of two things. So this Willis guy, now again, this is Lubbock's words about Willis. Willis apparently grew up in Louisiana, and probably Southwest Louisiana, where they have a cattle culture. He runs, so we don't know how he ends up in Texas. It's just that at some point he runs away from, he's sold to someone else. He runs away from them, and he gets a message. I don't know how, but he gets a message to Lubbock and says, "You should purchase me because I'm a good cowboy." So Lubbock, of course, doesn't go into any detail, but I can't imagine a businessman who would just take someone's word like, "Hey, I'm good at this job that requires these skills." So as I began to kind of think about, like, wow, Lubbock does purchase this person from whoever enslaved him, but Lubbock probably didn't just take his word for it. So there must have been some sort of way that, like, in one of the things about slavery is slaves were in communication with each other across plantations. There was what we call the grapevine, scholars call the grapevine network. And so it was a way that enslaved people communicated with each other and found out news about the world and what was happening. And so this is a possible way that he was able to get the word out to Governor Lubbock that he had skills as a horse. Now just think about this for a second, then I'll move on. You're a runaway slave, but you're so good at your job that you go to a slave owner and say, "I'm not good. You should take advantage of my labor." So Lubbock does. So what I would imagine, and this is conjecture, I would imagine that Lubbock would have had to see his skills. He's not going to just take the word of a runaway slave in particular. So at some point he had to have shown that I am a good cowboy. I'm damn good at it. Because he actually said it. So he would have had to, like, maybe break a horse or top off a horse. Topping off a horse is if there's a horse that's kind of difficult to ride, or it's not, horses have their own personalities, and sometimes they don't want nobody to ride them. So topping off a horse is kind of getting that horse rideable for other cowboys. He could have done something like that. We don't really know, but we know that because of the nature of business transactions and slavery works, he probably would have had to demonstrate his skills to Lubbock. So Lubbock tells us that he purchased him from whoever his enslaver was, and that he was the best cowboy he had ever had, ever. He actually says that Willis, I call him Willis, he says that Willis recorded a brand, I'm trying to find it, and he started to grow his own herd of cattle. So that means that, on top of all the ranching that he's doing, if he's his best cowboy, he's probably got a lot of responsibility, which is not uncommon in slavery. We see that enslaved people did have a lot of responsibility on different plantations. So that wouldn't be that uncommon. But on top of the labor he's performing for Governor Lubbock, he's actually started to grow his own herd of cattle. He registers a brand. Now, we understand that registering a brand is a business decision. This shows that he was very aware of the market economy that he was living in, because now this is a tricky kind of thing to consider, because as a slave, you really can't own property, but to register a brand shows that you do own property. Now, it would be difficult if, like, let's say someone took his herd of cattle. I don't know how that would be defended in the court of law, because technically, as an enslaved person, your property, your chattel, like, it's just a lot to kind of consider. But yet this man had so much value in himself that he decided that I'm worth this, and I want to do this, and I'm going to make my own wealth and purchase my own freedom. And that's what he did. He didn't purchase his own freedom, but he was able to negotiate and purchase the freedom of his wife and children. And Lubbock was like the guarantor. He put all the money in. Lubbock just guaranteed that that he would pay it off. So the Civil War comes, and Lubbock writes that Willis and his family and his herd of horses, his herd of cattle, however many that have been, he also had a small herd of horses, that they just disappeared from sight. Well, there is, and he says that they disappeared, which I don't know how that can happen, but they disappeared with his whole herd, and he had to pay the debt. We don't know if that's true. We don't know if he had to pay the debt or not. But the Civil War ended, and Texas was a wreck. There was not really a lot of accountability for things, so I don't know. But I won't say that he did it, because that's hard to say also. But what we do find is that this is in this is from the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867. And you can see here that one, Henry Willis, takes Francis Lubbock, white. So the C is for color, the W is for white. And he complains that he, Lubbock, has taken his cattle and horses given him by his former master, and that his brand is recorded, as Lubbock says. And you can see that from the Freedmen's Bureau, they referred it to Galveston, but they don't think there's anything that can be done for him. Now, I don't really know for sure if this is the same person, but this is the only time that Lubbock is found in these records. And clearly, this Henry Willis was a cattleman and a cowboy, and it's 1867, so he would have been an enslaved cowboy. So what this shows us is that, well, one, property of African Americans at that time was a very tenuous thing to hold on to, because a person, if they had the right status, could come and take what was yours. But yet and still, these people continued to show their determination. This is Hector Basie, and he is one of two autobiographies of a Black cowboy. The other one is Nat Love's. Now, if you guys know of any other ones that are out there, please let me know. But these are only two that I know of. And Hector Basie's is not published. And his memoir is about 30 pages, and it's just full with delicious, wonderful, savory details of what it was like to be a Black cowboy after the Civil War. Basie was born in, I think, 1851, around there. So he was for Texas, he would have been about 13. And he wasn't born on a ranch. He became a cowboy directly thereafter. But he does remember tending to the critters, as he called them, when he was young. And he talks about how they were like his best friends on the plantation. He says, they understood me and I understood them like no one else in the world. And I'm trying to wrap up because I want people to have a chance to ask questions. But so in his book, Basie talks about, and now this is after the Civil War. I want to make sure I'm clear. So Basie talks about his interactions with white cowboys and interactions with Black cowboys. And, he says that there weren't too many problems with race, but then like he says that this guy called me the N-word, or he shares a story of someone trying to take advantage of him like he also became a horse dealer, or someone trying to take advantage of him. But if he didn't have the protection of a white rancher, then that person would have taken his horses. So what that tells me is that Black and white cowboys did create a sense of fraternity. But it's also important to remember that this is the 1860s and 1870s in Texas, and there was a racial hierarchy, right? We just can't pretend like that didn't exist. And so, yes, there could be friendship and fraternity, because there are stories of Black cowboys where they're in these cattle towns, and a white cowboy from another outfit may call them out, and they go fisticuffs, and their cattle outfits, at least some of them, jump in and help them defend themselves, or they break them out of jail, which I'm not sure how much I believe some of those stories, because we also know that cowboys can tell fantastic stories. But so what we do know is that Black and white cowboys seem to have made the same amount of money when they were on the cattle trail. But what some white cowboys have written at the time was that, yeah, we kind of all made the same money, but the Black cowboys were expected to do a lot more work. They were expected to stand extra watches at night. They were expected to top off the horses in the morning for the white cowboys while they drank their coffee. But also we see, this is from Jim Perry, who is a character. He was on the XIT ranch, and he felt he was a damn good cowboy. And he said, if it wasn't for my damned old black face, I'd have been boss of one of the divisions. So he understood also that this is the time that we live in, but he was denied promotion because of race. So I bring this up because it's important. Like, yes, there was fraternity. Yes. I mean, these people survived stampedes together. These people's lives, they risked their lives together. They crossed flowing rivers. They helped each other across. And there was a sense of brotherhood that's created by it. But there also was still the racial attitudes of the day. And so it's important that as we think about Black cowboys and their contribution to cattle ranching, that we understand that they also had do a little bit more and to work harder. And that's just a part of what it means to be African-American in Texas at that time, and throughout the 60s and beyond. So now, this is a story that he talks about in his memoir. And so right after slavery, him and his brother take off, and they become cowboys. They start working on ranches and riding horses. And he tells his story of his brother. I remember to this day, he's talking about crossing a river. It was a swollen river. It was a pretty dangerous thing to do. And he says, I remember to this day, seeing my brother in the raging waters of the stream, struggling for his life. I knew how to swim, and so did he, but he was sucked under by a strong current, and never did I see him again. So he lost his brother. But then one of the things that he writes is that he didn't have any time to, he says, at the time, the death of was a small matter. And so no one mourned his loss except me. And I was wise enough to keep my grief to myself. So he had to mourn the loss of his brother alone. And again, these are ways that we see how pernicious racism can be. And yet he also will tell you that these men were good to him too. But it's an interesting way to understand. It gives you insight into what it was like to be a Black cowboy on the cattle trail. And I was going to talk about, it's 7:30. I'm sorry, you all. I was going to talk about how I was able to curate an exhibit on Black cowboys. And we bring this information to the public so that the kids can learn about Black cowboys. And from what they've reported to me, 66,000 people went through the exhibit. It was up from November to March. And the kids saw themselves, and it inspired art. Some of these kids have produced art of Black cowboys, of themselves as cowboys. And some of the art is actually hanging up in the Whitty Museum. And it all happened because my advisor, her mother, and this lady, Aaronetta Pierce, they were at some meeting or something. And Aaronetta Pierce, Miss Pierce, as I say, because she's in her late 80s. She's definitely always Miss Pierce to me. And she happens to mention in passing, hey, I want to do an exhibit on Black cowboys. And so my advisor's mother, my advisor is Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry. Her mother says to her, well, you won't believe this, but my daughter has a student that is studying enslaved and free Black cowboys. And so this lady, Miss Pierce, we coordinated a phone call, and it was actually an interrogation. And she wanted to make sure that I knew American history and slavery. And so for an hour, she just peppered me with questions, which also told me how much she knew about American history. And so we were able to produce this exhibit. And as far as we know, it's one of the first exhibits on Black cowboys in the United States.
What museum was that at?
The Whitty Museum in San Antonio. And San Antonio.
Oh,
yeah, no worries. These are some of the people we explored. This is Joanna July. Ooh, she was a mighty, mighty woman. These are some of the Angora chaps that was very similar to what Hector Basie wore. And then this is the exhibit hall itself when it opened. So sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, and you get to tell a story of something that's not known. And
so is that exhibit still there?
It's not. It's come down.
But is this a traveling exhibit?
It's going to be. So it should be at the Dallas African American Museum, hopefully in the spring of next year. They're still negotiating. There's a whole process that I just put stories together. I don't handle this part. And then so they're trying to negotiate with them because they don't want it to sit so the Smithsonian has shown a large interest for this exhibit to travel around the country, but it's the Smithsonian, and I'm in the military, so I know how the bureaucracy works. So we're trying to get it. We don't want it to sit and for people to forget. So we're trying to get it to travel in between. So they're trying to figure out. Right now, it's looking at going to the African American Museum in Dallas in the spring of next year. So keep it. That is something I will bring up with the people in charge. I think that's a great idea. And then from there, it's going to go to the Oklahoma City Cowboy Hall of Fame, which or Tulsa. Well, that is going to go to those two places, but the negotiations with the Smithsonian, that's a whole nother deal that I am very far removed from, and I'm also finishing a dissertation, so I will let them negotiate. I've only made one request, and that's for it to go to Boston, because I would like, because I mean, I just, you know, and there's some of the places where we don't know that this story exists. I apologize for talking so much, but if you have questions, I will sit here and answer them.
Thank you so much. Stick around. We can take a few questions. Is that okay, everyone?
Absolutely. This gentleman had his hand up really quickly.
Yes. Very good presentation. Historically, we hear about the hierarchy of the living conditions in the South, the slaves versus their owners. Mm-hmm. But I was listening to your presentation about the trail drivers. Mm-hmm. Everyone has to sleep outside on the ground.
Yeah.
No one gets about. Was there any hierarchy? Any data of hierarchy of the living conditions?
I don't know if I would say hierarchy of living conditions, but there definitely was a hierarchy in the cattle crew. But the trail boss was almost always white. I think I've seen maybe one or two stories of a black trail boss. One guy named Al Jones, which he's in the Trail Drivers Hall of Fame, I believe. But that's the only example I can think of. But there were different jobs in the cattle crew. But I don't know, like, with the exception of the trail boss, I don't know that there was ever any of those jobs a black cowboy was ever excluded from any of those jobs. Now, one place where African Americans and Mexican Americans are overrepresented in the cattle crew is as a wrangler. And the wrangler is the lowest job. Their job is to handle the remuda, and which is where the horses are. Now that is also where a lot of cowboys, black and Mexican cowboys, found entree into cattle work, and they started pretty young. But like, what's interesting, well, anyway, but so that's where, so like, it's hard to say, like, it seems like those interactions was where race was used as a hierarchy, but not necessarily in the jobs they did. But like, with the exception of like standing extra watches, with the exception of standing extra watch, like they would have to stand extra night watches, and things like that, and do extra chores, kind of. You had a question there.
That book, is it the Trail Drivers of Texas?
Yes.
Are black?
Yeah.
Cowboys represented?
They're represented. So like this. So there's two editions. They're from a number of different trail drivers, and there's black cowboys mentioned all throughout that. Sometimes we get their names, often we do not. But they talk about black cowboys that were there. Most of the stories are impressive, or they're just stories of guys working on cattle drives. There's also stories of there's some people, and I wish I would have looked at this, of where people talk about that. They come to Texas, they have their gold, and they have their slaves. And what we find is that there's one family who traded an enslaved girl for like 50 head of cattle, and that was their start in the cattle business. For people who were traveling from the South across to Texas, having slaves could be like almost like a way of a movable commodity, which is it's hard. Like sometimes I sit with these stories a lot, and it's hard to kind of go through them. I know that, but you know, you could sell your property and purchase slaves and not have to carry money, and that's something that we see that happen as people spread west during slavery. And then when they got to where they got, they used that enslaved person as they're starting the business. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving?
Yes, sir. Of course.
Are you familiar with the story at Weatherford where they're buried?
Yeah.
The black cowboy.
Bose Iker brought him back, right?
The black cowboy that was with
Goodnight.
Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. And when Charles Goodnight, Oliver Loving was killed, so Charles Goodnight took the black cowboy with him. And then when he would sell his cattle, he would give him all the money, and he'd keep all the money as they would return back to Texas. Yeah,
he was I think his name was Bose Iker. And he's a character as well. But he's
buried in Weatherford. You can actually go there and see the cemetery.
But he was born free, but his parents were enslaved. So that's an interesting story too. But yes. Let me make sure that anyone else had a question.
Ron, your presentation tonight is so close to Juneteenth. I'm wondering historically, Texas, the Texas Cowboys, how did ownership change for Black Americans after Juneteenth?
It's hard to say. I know what we saw with Henry Willis. He tried to grow his cattle and it was taken. Yeah. We know that there are Black ranchers. There's a family in Seguin, and their ranch has been in their family since 1870s. There's a ranch in outside of Austin, and that's been in the family for even a little bit longer because his name was Alexander, and he was freed, and his enslaver gave him a portion of his land, and he was a horse trainer more than a cowboy. And there's legend about him, about his involvement in breeding thoroughbreds in Texas and kind of helping to establish the quarter horse as the horse of the cowboy. So we know that there were also Black ranches that, I won't say immediately after the Civil War, but by the 1870s and 1880s, there were these free Black towns, freedom towns that prop up. And there's also Black ranchers. A.D. John is one. He's probably the most famous Black rancher. But there's tons more. And I'm trying to find those families. One of the things that we're doing with the exhibit is we have a place for people to just say, hey, if you know of more Black cowboys, let us know. Now, when it comes to Juneteenth, one of the things that actually did happen was, especially in Southeast Texas, was you had the Black rodeos start to show up. There's a scholar, and I can't think of his name because I can't afford to buy his $50 book. But he talks about the soul circuit. Now, he wrote an academic article, and the soul circuit is mainly, again, in the same region of the coastal prairies where there's a ton of Black cowboys to this day. And so there's quite a few of those rodeos that take place on Juneteenth. I actually went to one last weekend, but that one was fairly new. But there are some historically Black rodeos that happen on Juneteenth in Texas. And that Black rodeo circuit, it literally goes from East Texas all the way up to East Oklahoma. And so the Black rodeo I went to in Oklahoma. Can you hear me still? Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. I want to make sure. So the Black rodeo becomes a way to celebrate Juneteenth too for Black cowboys. Yeah. So.
Can I ask another question? You mentioned this at the very beginning of your talk about how the presentation of cowboys has been whitewashed. There's probably dozens of theories why.
Yeah. What
are some of your thoughts on why it transitioned to be so whitewashed?
I'm wrestling with this now, honestly, because so historians, we talk about there's ways that we remember things as people, right? We remember things in certain ways, but there are also ways that society creates its memories, and we call that collective memory. And one of the things that happens in collective memory is that the society decides what it wants to remember and decides what it wants to glorify and mythologize. And there's a lot of things that go into that. And we touched on briefly in the 1920s. So in the 1920s and 30s, what begins to happen is people begin, and then even early actually, people begin to see the West as disappearing, the open ranges as disappearing, and we become more industrialized, right? You have this age of industrialization that is just so rapid, and the cities are growing fast. There's full of immigrants and all these things that are still less than the Anglos. It's just a very chaotic time in American history. And so what begins to happen is people begin to create this idea of oh, I wish we had the West, right? The West was open. It was where a man could be a man. These ideas begin to happen. And then we begin to kind of create this image of the cowboy as what a real American man is like. And it happens slowly. It happens over decades. But then by the time you get to the 30s and you get to the early Westerns, and then you look at Birth of a Nation, which was an incredibly racist film. Yeah. And so you get to the creation of, so now that this myth has taken root by the 1930s, when Hollywood enters into it, they just magnify it. And when you look at the time period, you look at that time when they were thinking and they were writing about what it was to be an American. If you're going to use an image of the cowboy as what it means to be an American man, it definitely can't be Black at that time. Like Black can't be a standard for individualism, especially rugged individualism and masculinity in that time. If you look at how they wrote about Black men, you would definitely like, they were still called boys, even though they were men. That just gives you an idea. They were forced to step off the street if a white man or woman walked by. So that can't be the image of the cowboy. The cowboy has to be this image, and Hollywood just enshrines that. And so it's in that process of creating collective memory, creating a shared memory that America decided to forget, right? Because whenever you remember something, a lot of times you're deciding that you have to forget something else.
Unless you're Django.
Yeah. I have my problems with that movie as a historian, but I mean, it's interesting. That's an interesting. Well, he was a cowboy too, by the way. Yeah. But it's an interesting. Quentin Tarantino's crazy. Let's just say that. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah. I couldn't quite hear. What was the well-known African American ranching family? I couldn't hear.
Oh, the Wallaces, A.D. John Wallace. And he's out where's his ranch? I can't remember at the moment. Ma'am, you had a question?
Yes, I was struck in the example you used of Lubbock and his writing to the government about replacing personnel, basically. And you refer to the Cowboys, the Black Cowboys, as Negroes, which I was surprised because they were enslaved. And I'm surprised that he didn't just say slaves. They need to be replaced with slave labor. So that poked an idea in my mind, especially as you were talking about how the Cowboys, the Black enslaved, were sought out for doing that kind of work. Do you have any sense that the planters, the ranchers that own slaves, that utilize them for cowboy kind of work, cowhand work, cattle drives, that kind of thing, had any increased sense of, I don't know, not respect, but value for the Black Cowboys as opposed to other slaves that were doing work in the fields and were not as highly valued, except that they brought profits, but in terms of respecting them as persons for their skill or for their humanity. I mean, in your research.
I think one thing so slavery, because the institution was so violent, because the institution of slavery was so violent, we often forget that there were also relationships, and enslaved people took pride in what they did, regardless. Like there were just enslaved people, there were enslaved people that could pick 300 pounds of cotton in a day, right? You don't pick 300 pounds of cotton in a day unless you're taking pride in what you do. Like there's just, if you can get away, if I'm a slave, I ain't working hard for nobody. But for someone to decide that they're gonna, that's a decision that person made. So they can take pride in their work. And the enslavers knew who the best cotton pickers were, and those people were valued higher. And though they weren't sold either, unless it was necessary. So the idea, and like you can see it in Lubbock's, like his best cowboy was an enslaved man. So it's one of the interesting dichotomies of slavery, is where you can see someone as property, and yet I think this is what makes slavery so interesting and hard to understand, is because how can you see someone as your best cowboy, and yet you can see them as less than you are, even though they're your best cowboy? So this is one of the things about slavery that I think is an interesting juxtaposition, in that there's in the interpersonal relationships that exist, because they did know who the best enslaved people were at whatever job they were doing. Thomas Jefferson is an excellent example. When you look at the Hemmingses and the cooks that he created, and that were trained because he wanted good French food, which who doesn't? No, I'm kidding. But one of the things that he would do is that he would make them train their replacement, because he understood the value that they had, because they would run away. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson is he's a very complicated president. Yes.
Well, I think the Black Cowboy during the cattle driving years had skills that other Blacks didn't have. because it takes a lot of skill to be a cowboy.
It takes a lot of skill.
Horses, take care of cattle,
Mm-hmm.
and rope,
Mm-hmm.
and brand, and it's a full-time job.
Yeah, yeah. But there were also black stonemasons, and they had skills. Like there was also a lot of slaves. There were slaves that worked in cities, and so there's also a lot of skill. I think one of the things that and this is something that I think some slavery scholars are trying to like say, hold on, people, like we need to think about this a little bit. I don't know if you ever try to pick cotton, it is hard. It's very, very hard. And so to be able to I don't like referring to like the labor of people who work on plantations as if it was like unskilled labor, because it takes skill to be able to do those jobs. So like if you're looking at a person who's working on the sugar plantation, it takes skill to be able to chop down the sugar cane and not cut your leg off. Like one of the things I try to, and this is how I came to Black Cowboys and realized that we're slaves, was sometimes we have to reimagine our understanding of things, right? I mean, yes, now the kind of skills that a Black cowboy acquired is absolutely a different set of skills, but it's also, I think we have to be careful when we make sure we understand that the people who pick cotton also had a certain set of skills, and that's why like one of the things we have to realize is that's why they wanted to keep them on the land, right? They were regular, and this is the Union Army. One of the things that they encouraged, if you look at the Juneteenth announcement, was for them to stay on the land, sign contracts, and become indentured laborers, right? Laborers for the plantations that were on. They didn't want them to have the freedom of move because they needed to get the harvest in. So, and that required a laborer. That required a laborer who had the skills to be able to do it. But the Black cowboy, I mean, part of what I want to do is also like demystify it, right? We've kind of created a mythology of what the cowboy is. But when you look at the cowboy, that dude was just a hard-working guy with broken knuckles and broken ankles and whatnot. He's just a working class man that we've mythologized. But they were working class men trying to make their day and maybe have some whiskey at the end of it. The other
thing, the cowboy was an adventure for the cowboy.
Maybe.
He had a lot of freedoms, driving the cattle.
Yeah, but he had a lot of responsibility. Yeah, he had a lot of freedom. He had a lot of responsibility. They had to make choices. And sometimes for some people that was, I mean, I can imagine for a Black cowboy in particular, like you're out in the wilderness, you're not dealing with society, you're away from all the racial norms because you're in your cattle crew. These people become like your brothers. And I can imagine that for some of them, that would have been much better than being anywhere else in Texas in the 1870s.
One of the other things that was talked about is if there's Black cowboys and they're on a horse, they could have just take that horse and just take off cross country.
Not necessarily. I think there was one of the reasons why I wanted to show, when I showed you Perry's day book, it says that he went with them, is because there was always kind of someone watching them. They were never just, even though they were on horseback, there was always someone making sure that they were doing their job. I'm not saying that they were trying to keep them from running away, but they were there to let them know that we're there and we're watching. And there's also a lot of other things to consider. You may be able to ride a horse in your own neighborhood, but as soon as an African-American enslaved person gets to another county where he doesn't belong and he's on a horse, you become suspicious. And so then you have a different level of oversight. But also, I think more important is that these enslaved people, these enslaved cowboys, had families that they didn't want to run away from. I mean, and it's important that we humanize kind of like, yeah, no one wants to be a slave, but when you have a family, you have sons and daughters, and you have extended family who become like family, then it maybe running away is not the solution, but maybe staying is the best way to be a person.
Well, we could talk about this for a really long time, but I want to respect y'all's time, and I really appreciate y'all coming out today. And I especially want to thank Ron so much. This was a great presentation.
Thank you.